She stood on that rough-hewn wooden platform, clad in a simple white dress that offered little modesty against the judging eyes, tears tracing paths through the dust on her face. A cacophony of male voices barked numbers, reducing her to nothing more than an object, a prize to be won. This wasn't some feverish nightmare. This was a stark reality unfolding on a Tuesday afternoon in the hardscrabble town of Millfield, Kansas, where 19-year-old Cordelia May was about to be sold to the highest bidder. The Silver Dollar Saloon reeked of stale whiskey and desperation. Silas Crowder, a man whose soul seemed as tarnished as the coins that lined his pockets, stood beside the platform, a predatory grin plastered on his face. He hammered his gavel, the sound sharp and unsettling, mimicking a perverse auctioneer. "Gentlemen," his voice boomed, laced with leering anticipation. "Behold a genuine virgin, untouched and pure as the driven snow. The bidding starts at a mere $50. Cordelia's hands trembled, instinctively attempting to shield herself from the lewd stares. Orphaned at the tender age of 12, she had eked out a meager existence through kitchen work and laundry. Her fragile world crumbled last week when Crowder cornered her with a debt so insurmountable it felt like a life sentence. Her deceased father's gambling losses, a burden unjustly placed upon her shoulders. "Pay up, little dove, or work it off my way." "$60, a toothless miner hollered, his voice rough and eager. "70, another chimed in, their eyes gleaming with unsavory intent. Meanwhile, outside, Thaddeus Holloway, a man etched with the hardship of the prairie, was tying his weathered horse to the hitching post. His plan was simple: grab essential supplies and return to his modest farm before dusk, where his 8-year-old daughter, Minerva, awaited him. A widower for 3 long years, he poured his heart into cultivating his land and raising his child with integrity, striving to shield her from the growing darkness he saw encroaching upon the world. The raucous shouts and anguished cries emanating from the saloon abruptly halted his plans. Driven by an instinct he couldn't ignore, Thaddeus pushed through the saloon's bat-wing doors, expecting to find a card game turned violent. What he witnessed instead sent a chill down his spine, solidifying his resolve. There, upon that degrading platform, stood a girl, barely more than a child, being auctioned off as if she were inanimate property. Men, their faces flushed with drink and lust, reveled in her humiliation, treating her suffering as mere entertainment. "85, someone yelled, the bid cutting through the air like a whiplash. Cordelia's desperate gaze swept across the room, finally landing on Thaddeus. For a fleeting moment, their eyes met. He saw in her face a reflection of his own daughter. Raw, unadulterated terror mingled with a desperate plea for salvation, a silent prayer that someone, anyone, might offer a lifeline. $100. The voice belonged to Buck Morrison, a cattle rancher notorious for his brutal treatment of women, a man whose reputation preceded him like a storm cloud. Cordelia's face drained of all color, her hope flickering like a dying ember. Thaddeus felt his heart pounding against his ribs. He possessed exactly $93 in his pocket, money painstakingly saved for vital winter supplies, essential medicine for Minerva, and enough food to sustain them through the unforgiving months ahead. Squandering it would condemn them to real hardship. But as he continued to gaze at the terrified girl, then at the predatory figures surrounding her, a profound realization washed over him. Some things transcended the value of mere money. $200, he roared, his voice filled with a sudden, unshakable conviction. Every head in the saloon swiveled in his direction. Thaddeus stepped forward, his stance unwavering despite the frantic rhythm of his pulse. The crowd erupted in a shocked murmur. $200 was more than most men earned in half a year. Silas Crowder's eyes gleamed with avarice, his smile widening like a viper ready to strike. Well, well, do I hear 210? The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Buck Morrison fixed Thaddeus with a menacing glare, his hand instinctively drifting towards the holstered gun at his hip. You sure you want to make an enemy today, farmer? But what Thaddeus declared next reverberated through the saloon, forever altering the trajectory of their lives and plunging them both into immediate danger. This girl is coming home with me, Thaddeus announced, his voice cutting through the oppressive atmosphere. But not for what any of you are thinking. The saloon erupted in a cacophony of confused murmurs. Silas Crowder banged his gavel, eager to finalize the deal before anyone had a chance to reconsider. "Sold to the gentleman farmer for $200. Buck Morrison's face twisted into a mask of incandescent rage. Nobody outbid Buck Morrison. Nobody dared to humiliate him in front of the entire town. His hand remained dangerously close to his cold .45 as he watched Thaddeus count out the bills with steady fingers. Cordelia couldn't comprehend the whirlwind of events that had just transpired. She had fervently prayed for a miracle, for a glimmer of hope in the encroaching darkness. But she knew from bitter experience that rescue rarely came without a hefty price. Men didn't expend such a sum of money without expecting something substantial in return. Her entire body trembled uncontrollably as she descended from the platform, her legs unsteady beneath her. Thaddeus approached her with a deliberate gentleness, as if she were a fragile, wounded animal. "Miss, I need you to understand something right now. You are safe. I have a daughter near your age, and I simply couldn't stand idly by and watch this happen. You're not going to—" Cordelia whispered, her voice choked with emotion, unable to complete the sentence. "No, ma'am. We're walking out of here, and you're coming to my farm, where you'll have food, shelter, and respect. Nothing more will be expected." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Cordelia felt a sliver of hope bloom within her chest, allowing her to breathe a little easier. But that fleeting sense of relief lasted a mere 30 seconds before shattering into a million pieces. Buck Morrison stepped directly into their path, effectively blocking their exit. "Hold on there, farmer. Nobody spends $200 on charity alone. What's your real angle here?" "No angle, just doing what's right," Thaddeus replied, his voice firm. "Right?" Buck spat, a dark glint in his eyes. "Boy, you just made the biggest mistake of your pathetic life. That girl owes Crowder money, which means she owes me money. I had a prior claim." Thaddeus felt a cold dread creep into his bones. "What prior claim?" Silas Crowder suddenly looked nervous, his composure crumbling under the weight of Buck's accusation. "Now, Buck, we had a deal. Fair auction, fair sale, fair." Buck's voice rose, laced with a palpable threat. "You conveniently forgot to mention our little arrangement to Farmer Boy here, didn't you, Crowder? About how I already slipped you $50 last week for first dibs on this little dove?" A collective gasp swept through the saloon as the crowd instinctively recoiled, inching towards the walls. When Buck Morrison lost his temper, people invariably got hurt, or worse. Cordelia instinctively grabbed Thaddeus's arm, her eyes wide with terror. "Please, just leave me. Don't get yourself killed over someone like me." But Thaddeus had already noticed a subtle shift in the room, a calculated maneuver that sent a wave of icy foreboding washing over him. 3 of Buck's henchmen had quietly positioned themselves near the exit, effectively cutting off their escape route. 2 more flanked the bar, their faces grim and resolute. They weren't simply dealing with one angry rancher. They were surrounded, trapped like rats in a cage. "You got 2 choices, farmer," Buck said, slowly drawing his gun halfway from its holster, the metallic click echoing in the tense silence. "Walk away and leave the girl here, or try to leave with her and see what happens." Thaddeus looked into Cordelia's petrified face, then down at his own hands, hands calloused and worn from years of honest labor, hands that had never held a gun in anger, hands better suited to plowing fields than engaging in a deadly gunfight. He thought of Minerva, patiently waiting at home, needing her father, her protector. The logical choice, the smart choice, was painfully obvious, but sometimes doing what was right meant embracing what was foolish, even suicidal. "We're leaving together," Thaddeus said quietly, his voice resonating with unwavering resolve, placing himself squarely between Cordelia and Buck's menacing gun. "And if you want to stop us, you'll have to shoot an unarmed man in front of 20 witnesses." Buck's eyes narrowed, scrutinizing Thaddeus's resolve. "You think I won't? I think you're mean, but you're not stupid. Sheriff Palmer's office is right across the street. You gun down an innocent farmer in cold blood, you'll hang before sundown." The standoff stretched, taut as a drawn bowstring. Every man in the saloon held his breath, waiting to see who would break first. Cordelia pressed closer to Thaddeus, feeling the tremor in his hands despite the unwavering steadiness of his voice. Then, Buck started laughing, a chilling, mirthless sound that sent shivers down everyone's spines, raising the hairs on the back of their necks. "You're right, Farmer. I ain't stupid, which is why I ain't going to shoot you here." He slowly holstered his gun, his movements deliberate, almost theatrical. "But Millfield's a small town. Roads get mighty dangerous after dark. Accidents happen all the time." Thaddeus felt his throat constrict, his heart pounding in his chest. Buck was allowing them to leave, but only to lure them into a more isolated location outside the town limits, where he could exact his revenge without fear of witnesses or legal repercussions. "Smart man would cut his losses and ride on," Thaddeus retorted, his voice barely a whisper. "Smart man wouldn't have started this fight in the first place." Buck's grin turned predatory, revealing the darkness that lurked beneath his civilized veneer. "But you did start it, Farmer, and I always finish what gets started." Silas Crowder cleared his throat nervously, attempting to diffuse the escalating tension. "Gentlemen, perhaps we can reach a mutually agreeable solution. Buck, you keep the 50 you already paid me. Farmer gets the girl. You get your money back. Everybody's happy." "Nobody's happy," Buck snarled, his gaze unwavering. "I don't want my $50 back. I want what I paid for." Thaddeus gently guided Cordelia towards the saloon doors, moving slowly and deliberately to avoid triggering a violent outburst. The crowd parted before them, as if they were walking through a volatile minefield. Every step felt like it might be their last. They reached the Batwing doors when Buck's voice echoed behind them, laced with menace. "Farmer, what's your name? I'd like to know what to carve on your grave marker." Thaddeus paused, his hand resting on the rough wood of the doorframe. Giving his name meant Buck could easily locate his farm, potentially threatening Minerva. But attempting to conceal his identity would only delay the inevitable. "Thaddeus Holloway, and you won't need a marker because I don't plan on dying today." They stepped out of the dimly lit saloon and into the blinding afternoon sunlight, but freedom felt like a cruel illusion. Main Street stretched before them, a dusty gauntlet leading to an uncertain future. Thaddeus's horse patiently waited at the hitching post, but his farm was 8 long miles away, across the desolate expanse of the prairie. 8 miles where Buck Morrison could do as he pleased, with no consequences to fear. Cordelia whispered urgently, her voice trembling with fear. "There's something you need to know about Buck, something Crowder deliberately omitted. He's not just mean. 3 months ago, he murdered a preacher's daughter who tried to escape him. Sheriff Palmer covered it up because Buck owns half this county." Thaddeus felt his world tilt on its axis, the ground swaying beneath his feet. He had unknowingly signed their death warrants, and the very authorities sworn to uphold the law were complicit in their potential demise. But as they reached his horse, Cordelia noticed something that made her blood run cold, turning her limbs to ice. A small figure was running towards them down Main Street, calling out in a familiar, childlike voice, "Papa! Papa, you're back!" It was Minerva, and she was unknowingly running headfirst into the most perilous situation of her young life. Thaddeus's heart seized in his chest, his breath catching in his throat, as his innocent 8-year-old daughter came bounding down the dusty street, her blonde braids bouncing with each step, completely oblivious to the imminent danger that surrounded them. Minerva, in her innocent naivete, had disobeyed his strict instructions to remain with Mrs. Henderson and had somehow managed to make her way to town alone. "Minerva, stop!" he called out, his voice hoarse with panic. But she was too excited, too eager to listen. Behind them, Buck Morrison emerged from the saloon with his men, and Thaddeus witnessed the precise moment when Buck's twisted mind began to formulate a new, even more sinister plan. The rancher's eyes locked onto the approaching child, and his cruel grin morphed into something truly monstrous. "Well, well," Buck said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like Farmer Boy brought his little girl to town. Sweet thing, ain't she?" Cordelia grabbed Thaddeus's arm, her grip tightening with each passing second. "He's going to use her against you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Minerva reached them, breathless from her run. "Papa, Mrs. Henderson got sick and I was scared, so I came to find you," she said, her words tumbling over each other in her haste. Her sentence abruptly ended and her face lost some excitement as she noticing the unfamiliar woman standing beside her father and the palpable tension that permeated the air. "Honey," Thaddeus said carefully, his voice strained. "I need you to get behind me and stay very quiet. Do you understand?" But Buck was already moving closer, his spurs jingling with each deliberate step, the sound echoing ominously in the tense silence. "That's a mighty pretty daughter you got there, Holloway. Be a real shame if something happened to her on account of your poor judgment." The veiled threat hit Thaddeus like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. This was no longer solely about him and Cordelia. Buck had just made it abundantly clear that Minerva was now an integral part of this deadly game. "You touch one hair on her head," Thaddeus began, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You'll what?" Buck interrupted, his voice dripping with mockery. "Fight me? You ain't even armed, farmer. But I tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to give you one last chance to be smart. Leave the girl here with me and walk away. Your daughter goes home safe, you go home safe. Everybody's happy." "Leave Cordelia with you, you mean?" Thaddeus clarified, his voice barely a whisper. "That's exactly what I mean." Thaddeus felt the crushing weight of the impossible choice bearing down upon him, threatening to suffocate him. He could save Cordelia and potentially risk his daughter's life, or sacrifice Cordelia to protect Minerva. Either decision would irrevocably scar him, leaving an indelible mark on his soul. Minerva tugged on his coat, her small hand gripping the fabric tightly. "Papa, I'm scared. Who is this man?" Cordelia knelt down beside the little girl, her voice soft and reassuring. "Honey, my name's Cordelia. Your papa's trying to help me, but it's gotten complicated." "Are you in trouble?" Minerva asked, her innocent eyes filled with concern. "Yes, sweetheart, very bad trouble." Minerva looked up at her father with those trusting blue eyes that so vividly reminded him of her late mother, Sarah. "Papa always helps people in trouble. Mama taught him that." The unwavering innocence in her voice pierced Thaddeus's heart, tightening the knot in his chest. His beloved wife, Sarah, had indeed instilled in him the importance of standing up for those who couldn't defend themselves, of offering aid to those in need. But Sarah had never had to face a monster like Buck Morrison. Buck stepped closer, his patience visibly eroding with each passing moment. "Time's up, farmer. What's it going to be?" "If you were Thaddeus, what would you do? Sacrifice an innocent girl to save your own daughter, or risk everything to protect them both?" This question burned in Thaddeus's mind. He looked at his daughter, then at Cordelia, then at the silent crowd of onlookers who were watching this agonizing drama unfold as if it were a form of twisted entertainment. In that moment, he realized something profound, something that would forever alter the course of their lives, setting the stage for either their salvation or their ultimate demise. "You're right, Buck. I'm not armed," Thaddeus said, his voice strangely calm despite the storm raging within him. "But you're wrong about one thing." "Yeah? What's that, farmer?" Buck spat, his face contorting with arrogance. "You think this is just between you and me, but look around." Buck frowned, momentarily confused by Thaddeus's cryptic statement. That fleeting moment of uncertainty would prove to be his undoing. Thaddeus gestured towards the growing crowd that had spilled out of the nearby shops and businesses, drawn by the escalating confrontation. "Half this town's been watching you threaten a child, Buck. Sheriff Palmer might be in your pocket, but Judge Crawford isn't, and neither is the territorial marshal, who's due through here next week." Buck's confidence flickered, a subtle tremor in his facade of invincibility. Thaddeus seized the opportunity, pressing his advantage. "You see, Buck, you made this public, really public. And now everyone's going to remember the day Buck Morrison threatened to hurt an 8-year-old girl because her daddy wouldn't let him buy a woman like she was cattle." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Thaddeus was right. This had become a public spectacle, and Buck's well-earned reputation for cruelty was now on full display, tarnishing his image in front of the entire town. "Furthermore," Thaddeus continued, his voice growing stronger, resonating with newfound conviction, "that woman you're so desperate to claim, she's got family coming to look for her. Cordelia, tell him about your brother." Cordelia, understanding the implicit need for deception, caught on immediately. "My brother James rides with the Pinkerton agency. He'll be here within the week, and he doesn't take kindly to men who hurt his sister." It was a complete fabrication, a desperate gamble, but Buck didn't know that. The Pinkerton Detective Agency was feared throughout the West, and even Buck Morrison didn't relish the prospect of attracting that kind of attention. Buck's face contorted with rage and frustration, his carefully constructed plan unraveling before his very eyes. "You think you're real clever, don't you, farmer?" "I think I'm real tired of this conversation," Thaddeus replied, his voice laced with weariness. "Minerva, Cordelia, get on the horse." As they moved towards the hitching post, Buck made a desperate, last-ditch effort to salvage the situation. "Tommy, Jake, block their path!" Two of Buck's men stepped forward, their hands hovering dangerously close to the guns holstered at their hips. The crowd gasped, instinctively backing away, bracing themselves for the inevitable bloodbath that was about to erupt on Main Street. But before anyone could react, an unexpected voice cut through the mounting tension. "I wouldn't do that if I were you boys." Everyone turned to see Doc Whitman emerging from his office across the street, his face grim and resolute. But he wasn't alone. Behind him stood Reverend Mills, the shopkeeper Harold Chen, and 6 other townsmen, all armed with rifles and shotguns. Doc Whitman adjusted his spectacles and addressed Buck directly, his voice firm and unwavering. "Morrison, we've had enough of your bullying in our town. These good people have done nothing wrong, and we won't stand by and watch you terrorize a child." Buck looked around wildly, his eyes darting from face to face, assessing the rapidly changing situation. Suddenly, his 5 men seemed awfully outnumbered, outgunned. The crowd that had previously been passive observers had now clearly chosen sides, and they weren't siding with him. "This ain't over!" Buck snarled, his voice filled with venom. "Yes, it is," Doc Whitman said firmly, his gaze unwavering. "Pack up your men and ride out of town today and don't ever come back to Millfield. Is that clear?" For a moment, it appeared as though Buck might draw his gun anyway. Consequences be damned. His hand hovered over the worn leather of his holster, his knuckles white with rage, as he faced down 8 armed men. Then, Silas Crowder, sensing an opportunity to further his own agenda, made everything worse. "Buck, you still owe me $300 from last month's poker game. Maybe it's time to settle accounts." Buck's face went ashen, drained of all color. He had completely forgotten about that lingering debt, and now he was cornered, trapped both financially and physically. But what Crowder said next sparked the violence everyone was desperately trying to avoid. If you're enjoying this story, hit that subscribe button because it's about to get even more intense. "As a matter of fact," Crowder continued, a nasty smile spreading across his face, "I think that debt just transferred to our new friends here. Congratulations, farmer. You just inherited Buck Morrison's biggest problem." The implications of Crowder's words washed over everyone present, sending a ripple of apprehension through the crowd. If Buck owed Crowder money, and Crowder was transferring that debt to Thaddeus, it meant Buck now had a seemingly legitimate legal claim that he could pursue through violence. "That's not how debts work, Crowder," Doc Whitman said sharply, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Actually, it is," came a new voice from the crowd. Judge Crawford himself had arrived, drawn by the commotion, his presence adding another layer of complexity to the already volatile situation. If Crowder wants to assign Morrison's debt to Holloway, that's within his legal rights. But, he continued, raising his voice as Buck started to grin triumphantly, Morrison would have to willingly agree to the transfer, and the debt would have to be deemed legitimate. Buck's grin faltered, the triumphant gleam in his eyes dimming considerably. Judge Crawford was renowned for his strict interpretation of the law, and he clearly wasn't intimidated by anyone, regardless of their wealth or influence. "Show me the paperwork, Crowder," the judge demanded, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Silas Crowder's face went deathly pale, his bravado evaporating like mist in the morning sun. There was no paperwork because the poker debt was entirely fictional, a desperate attempt to create leverage in a rapidly deteriorating situation. "I see," Judge Crawford said, his voice laced with contempt. "It was merely a gentleman's agreement. No paperwork means no legal debt. Morrison, you and your men have exactly 10 minutes to leave town before I charge you with disturbing the peace and threatening children." Buck's last card had been played and lost. His men were already backing towards their horses, their faces etched with relief, clearly eager to avoid a potentially deadly showdown with half the town. But Buck Morrison had never been one to accept defeat gracefully. "This ain't over, Holloway," he spat, his voice filled with venom. "Not by a long shot. You cost me money, you cost me face, and you made me look like a fool. I got a long memory and a longer reach than you think." Thaddeus helped Cordelia and Minerva onto his horse. his movements deliberate and cautious. "I reckon it is over, Buck. You lost fair and square." "Fair?" Buck's laugh was bitter, devoid of any humor. "Boy, you don't know the first thing about fair, but you're going to learn." As Buck and his men rode out of town, their figures disappearing over the crest of the distant hills, the crowd slowly began to disperse, their curiosity satisfied, their adrenaline levels returning to normal. Doc Whitman approached Thaddeus with a concerned expression on his weathered face. "Son, you did the right thing today, but Morrison's not the type to forget a grudge. You might want to consider staying in town for a few days. Let things cool down a bit." Thaddeus shook his head, his jaw set with determination. "Can't do it, Doc. I got a farm to run, animals to feed. Besides, running scared just invites more trouble." "Then take this," Doc Whitman said, pressing a small object into Thaddeus's hand. It was a small Derringer pistol, easily concealable, a weapon of last resort. "It ain't much, but it's better than nothing." Cordelia looked at the little gun with obvious fear, her face paling even further. "Maybe the doctor's right. Maybe we should wait just until things settle down." "No," Thaddeus said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We leave now, while we have daylight and witnesses to our departure. Buck's more likely to try something if we look afraid." They were preparing to leave when Minerva tugged on her father's sleeve, her brow furrowed with concern. "Papa, the lady seems sad. Is she going to be okay?" Thaddeus looked at Cordelia, really looked at her for the first time since this all began. She was pale, visibly shaking, and clearly traumatized by everything that had transpired. "Cordelia," he said gently, his voice filled with empathy. "Are you all right?" She shook her head slowly, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. "I don't understand why you helped me. Men don't usually help without wanting something in return. My wife taught me that protecting innocent people is what separates us from the animals. You're innocent, and you needed protecting." Tears began to flow freely down Cordelia's cheeks, washing away the grime and despair that had clung to her for so long. "Your wife sounds like she was a wonderful woman." "She was, and she'd want me to make sure you're safe." But as they finally rode out of Millfield, heading towards Thaddeus's farm, none of them noticed the lone rider who had been watching them from the hills above town. Buck Morrison had sent one of his men ahead to scout their route home, ensuring that their troubles were far from over. The real danger, they soon realized, was just beginning. The ride to Thaddeus's farm should have taken approximately 40 minutes, but they barely made it halfway before the shooting started. It happened at Devil's Canyon, a narrow pass where the road wound precariously between two rocky hills. Thaddeus had always hated this stretch of the trail, recognizing it as a prime location for ambushes with limited escape routes. The first bullet shattered the silence, kicking up dust inches from their horses' hooves, a stark warning of the impending violence. Thaddeus immediately pulled hard on the reins, steering the horse behind a large boulder, using it as a shield against the hail of gunfire. "Stay down!" he shouted, covering Minerva and Cordelia with his body, instinctively protecting them from harm. From the hills above came Buck Morrison's voice, ugly with triumph, echoing through the canyon. "Thought you were real smart back in town, didn't you, farmer? But out here, there ain't no judge to protect you. Now you're going to pay for your mistakes." Thaddeus quickly assessed the situation, counting the muzzle flashes. 4 men positioned on the left ridge, 2 on the right. They were completely surrounded, trapped with nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. "What do you want, Buck?" Thaddeus called out, his voice strained with a mixture of fear and defiance. "I want my property back, and I want you to pay for making me look like a fool in front of the whole town. You humiliated me, and now you're going to pay the price." Cordelia grabbed Thaddeus's arm, her grip desperate, her eyes wide with terror. "Just give me to him. Don't let him hurt Minerva because of me, please, Thaddeus." "Nobody's giving anybody to anybody," Thaddeus said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Doc Whitman's Derringer, knowing it held only 2 shots against 6 armed men. It was a meager defense, but it was all they had. Minerva was crying softly, her small body trembling with fear. "Papa, I'm scared," she whimpered. "I know, honey. Just stay behind this rock and don't move, no matter what happens. I'll protect you." Another volley of shots peppered their hiding spot, sending shards of rock flying and creating a deafening roar within the narrow canyon. Buck was clearly enjoying this, drawing out the torment, terrorizing them before moving in for the final kill. Then, Thaddeus heard something that made his heart race, filling him with a surge of desperate hope. Hoofbeats. More riders were approaching, fast, from the direction of town. Someone had followed them. "Buck!" shouted a familiar voice echoing through the canyon. "This is Judge Crawford. You're surrounded. Stand down and release the woman and child now, or you will face the full extent of the law." The shooting stopped abruptly, the silence that followed deafening. Thaddeus risked a quick look around the boulder and saw an amazing sight. Doc Whitman, Reverend Mills, and 8 other townsmen had ridden out after them, armed to the teeth and ready for a fight. "You got no authority out here, Crawford!" Buck yelled back, his voice laced with desperation. "I got all the authority I need when you're threatening innocent people in my jurisdiction. Attempted murder, kidnapping, assault, I can lock you away for a long time, Morrison." "Your jurisdiction ends at the town limits," Buck protested, his voice growing increasingly frantic. "Not when I'm pursuing criminals who disturb the peace in my town," Crawford retorted, his tone unwavering. For several tense minutes, the two groups faced off across the canyon, each side waiting for the other to make the first move. Buck's 6 men were outnumbered by Crawford's 9, and the odds had shifted dramatically in Thaddeus's favor. Then Cordelia did something that shocked everyone. She stood up from behind the boulder, fully exposing herself to Buck's guns, her figure silhouetted against the setting sun. "Cordelia, get down!" Thaddeus hissed, his voice filled with panic, but she ignored him, her gaze fixed on Buck, her voice growing stronger, more confident. "Buck Morrison!" she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the canyon, echoing off the rock walls. "I got something to tell you about Silas Crowder, something that's going to change everything." "Cordelia, get down!" Thaddeus yelled again, but she continued, her voice filled with conviction. "Buck, you want to know why Crowder was so eager to auction me off? You want to know the real reason he set this whole thing up? It wasn't just about the money. It was a personal vendetta, and I discovered his secret. That's why he had to get rid of me." Buck's curiosity got the better of his anger, overriding his initial impulse to simply shoot her down. "What are you talking about, girl?" he demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. "Crowder's been stealing from you for months. That poker debt he mentioned, he made it up. He's been skimming off your cattle sales right under your nose. I kept his books, Buck. I know where he hides the money. He set this whole thing up because he discovered that I know his secrets." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the gentle whisper of the wind through the canyon. Then, Buck's voice came back, but now it was directed at his men, his tone filled with a dangerous calculation. "Boys, I think we've been shooting at the wrong people." Buck Morrison rode down from the ridge, his gun still drawn, but no longer pointed at Thaddeus, Cordelia, or Minerva. His face showed the dangerous calculation of a man whose anger had found a new target, a new outlet for his rage. "You saying Crowder's been stealing from me?" Buck demanded, his voice low and menacing. Cordelia nodded, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "For 3 months I worked in that saloon keeping his ledgers. Every cattle deal you made, every sale, every transaction, Crowder took 20% off the top and doctored the books to hide it. I can prove it. The evidence is all there in his books." "Where's the money hidden?" Buck asked, his voice barely a whisper. "In a false bottom of his office safe. Has to be close to $2,000 by now." Buck's eyes went cold as winter. $2,000 was serious money, enough to buy a small ranch or pay a dozen men's wages for a year. If Cordelia was telling the truth, Crowder had been stealing his future piece by piece. Judge Crawford rode closer, keeping his rifle ready, his eyes fixed on Buck. "Morrison, this doesn't change what you did here today. Attempted murder is still attempted murder. You threatened a child, you fired upon innocent people." But Buck was already backing away, his mind clearly focused on his newfound target. "Judge, I think we got a misunderstanding here. I was just trying to recover stolen property, my money that Crowder stole. The shooting, just warning shots," Buck said with a straight face, his voice dripping with insincerity. "Just trying to get their attention." Thaddeus knew Buck was lying, but he also knew the man was desperately looking for a way out, a way to avoid further bloodshed. Smart men took the exits they were offered, even if they were coated in deceit. "So we're done here?" Thaddeus asked carefully, his hand resting protectively on Minerva's shoulder. Buck looked at Cordelia one more time, and for a moment, the old hunger flickered in his eyes, a brief flash of possessiveness. Then the practical side of his nature won out, overriding his baser instincts. "Girl, you come testify about Crowder's thievery and we're square. You helped me recover my stolen money. I'll forget about our other business." Cordelia nodded quickly, her voice filled with relief. "I'll tell Judge Crawford everything I know. I want to see Crowder punished for what he's done." "Good enough," Buck said, his voice devoid of emotion. He turned his horse toward town. "Boys, we got a saloon keeper to visit. It seems we have some debts to settle." As Buck and his men rode away, disappearing down the narrow trail, Thaddeus finally allowed himself to breathe, releasing the tension that had been constricting his chest for what seemed like an eternity. The immediate danger was over, but he knew Cordelia had just made herself a very valuable witness, and potentially a target for Crowder's revenge. Judge Crawford approached them with a relieved expression on his weathered face. "That was quick thinking, young lady. You saved all our lives, but you realize Crowder is going to be mighty unhappy when he finds out what you just did." "Crowder can't hurt me anymore," Cordelia said with surprising confidence, her voice resonating with newfound strength. "I'm not alone now. I finally found a place where I belong and have a new family to call my own." She looked at Thaddeus and Minerva, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, she smiled. It was a small smile, fragile as spring ice, but it was genuine, a testament to the hope that had been rekindled within her heart. The ride back to Thaddeus's farm was peaceful, uneventful. Minerva chattered excitedly about the adventure. Already, what started as a desperate situation filled with darkness and injustice ultimately transformed into a story about unexpected courage, the power of community, and the unwavering strength of the human spirit. Thaddeus, Cordelia, and even Minerva in her innocence showed us that even in the face of overwhelming odds, doing what's right, standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves, can spark change and create a ripple effect of goodness. It reminds us that family isn't always about blood, but about the bonds we forge through shared experiences and mutual respect. What did you think of Thaddeus's choices? Or Cordelia's bravery? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. Any questions, reactions, or anything else that struck you about the story. Let's chat. And if you enjoyed this wild ride, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We've got plenty more stories just like this one coming your way, and you won't want to miss a single adventure.